Hi, this is Matt Plummer and welcome to the California Quest. In today's debate, we are tackling the question of should California build massive offshore wind farms? So a little context there. California is in a race to transition to 100% renewable energy by 2045. They see this offshore wind farms as being a key to achieving that goal, with plans to build 4.5 gigawatts of offshore farms. And the question is this the right path to achieving that renewable energy goal? And is it the right thing to do to launch into these big offshore wind farms? So before we jump into the case for this and the case against, let's start with some context on offshore wind farms. So first of all, the important thing to know here is that in December, the federal government, which owned the offshore property, held its first ever lease off the West Coast for wind farms. And this was really a massive deal. They have been auctioning off land on the East Coast for a while. Europe's been doing this even longer, but this was the first time on the West Coast. They auctioned off 5 sites covering about 583 square miles. So in about 20 miles off the coast of Morro Bay, which is Central Coast around San Luis Obispo, and then off the coast of Humboldt County, which is more northern California, by Eureka. So these 5 sites were auctioned off for $757 million. Now again, these offshore wind farms have been reasonably common, particularly in Europe and even on the East Coast, but there's something different here in California that has made this one of the last places for this to happen. And that is because if you look at the ocean floor depth going off the West Coast, it gets really deep really fast. And so when we'll talk about this more, but the construction and the nature of the wind turbines actually has to be different. They are floating turbines versus anchored to the sea floor through a solid material going all the way up to the turbine itself. And so a little different in terms of how this would have to happen. So that's why this is new. This has been a little while coming. So in May 2021, Biden and Newsom made an agreement that they would lease the land. And then in September of 2021, the California legislature actually pushed forward with AB 525, which signed into law a requirement requiring the California Energy Commission to both set targets for how much power would be coming from offshore wind by 2030 and then 2045, and then also a strategic plan for achieving those targets. So this has been coming over the last few years. December was when the auction hit. Hadib Dagar, who is helping develop these wind farms, and in particular the technology around the floating turbines, frames this debate really well. So let me read Hadib's statement here. There's a lot of opportunities, but there's also some challenges. California has deeper water than any other areas where these floating turbines so far are in the world. How do you protect the environment, protect local stakeholders, protect the fisheries, protect indigenous communities, while also speeding up permitting so we make a difference with global climate change? That is the debate. Should California build massive wind farms off the coast? Let's look at both the case for and the case against. So on the case for, number 1, offshore wind farms can generate a significant amount of renewable energy. Number 2, offshore wind farms produce energy when it is needed most. That is really important when you think about shifting most of the energy mix to renewable sources. Number 3, offshore wind farms don't use land and block the view. All right, let's look at the case against moving forward with building these massive offshore wind farms. Number 1, offshore wind energy is very expensive. Number 2, we currently lack the infrastructure to build and operate these wind farms. That has to do with the port infrastructure that will be on the coast where these wind farms are set out into sea. And then number 3, offshore wind farms will hurt the environment and the fishing industry. So that is the case for and the case against. Let's start by jumping into the case for with the level of energy that these offshore wind farms can produce. Offshore wind farms can generate a significant amount of energy. So this project is scaled at the level of 4.5 gigawatts, which they say can power about 1.5 million homes. And that will provide almost 7% of the state's energy, which is 50% more than current wind energy is providing for the state. So this would be a significant uptick for the contribution of wind energy to the state. It would also help California achieve its goal of 5 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030 and contribute to the larger goal, which is 100% clean electricity by 2045. So Governor Newsom explains this. He says, offshore wind is a critical component to achieving our world-leading clean energy goals, and this sale is a historic step on California's march towards a future free of fossil fuels. So actually, without this increase in wind power, the calculations are such that, they don't feel that California can actually hit those goals. So here is a quote where it says, the state's 2021 SB 100 Joint Agency Report concludes that for California to reach 100% clean energy by 2045, it will need a broad range of renewable energy that includes offshore wind. The study's scenario calls for 10 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2045, or as much as the model will allow. So basically, without this, the state will not be able to achieve its 2045 goal of 100% clean electricity. The other thing to note is that while this is a pretty massive jump to 4.5 gigawatts, there is potential for a lot more offshore wind development according to the analysis of what level of wind and energy could be produced offshore. So the National Renewable Energy Laboratory reports that California has an enormous 200 gigawatts of offshore wind technical power potential, representing more than 250% of the state's current electricity use. So the idea that, yes, this will produce a lot of power, could be 7% of the state, increase wind contribution by 50%, but also that this would just be the beginning, 4.5 gigawatts versus a potential of 200. So that is number one in the case for that there is potential for this to produce a whole lot of clean, renewable energy. Let's look at number two. Offshore wind farms produce energy when it is needed most. So as the state moves towards increasing reliance on renewable energy, in particular solar, the challenge becomes that solar power is generated when the sun is out. And that is a problem because peak demand for energy is between 4 and 9 p.m. Some of that overlaps with when the sun is out, but some of that goes beyond when the sun is out. And so that creates problems because at this point, the technology is not there to store massive amounts of solar power. And so that means that we need to have energy sources that are able to provide when the sun goes down. And right now what happens is we still rely on what's called peaker plants for as much as 60% of our electricity. More solar panels and storage capacity will help, but they are unlikely to close the gap fast enough at an affordable price. Basically, California needs to procure a diverse portfolio of renewable energy, including offshore wind. And so, this is the concept that it needs another power source to fill in after the sun sets. And the good thing about offshore wind, even compared to onshore wind, is that it is strongest in the late afternoon and evening, which is exactly when the peak demand for power is. Experts say that it has a very different profile compared to onshore. It actually corresponds and coincides very well with the demand profile. And so another advantage of offshore wind, even relative to onshore wind. And third, and this also differentiates it between onshore wind, is that offshore wind doesn't use land or block the view. So when it is far enough offshore, it doesn't block the view. Now, the interesting thing is that, what folks say is that offshore wind turbines don't have as much of a visual impact when they are at least 25 miles off the coast. Now, as you might remember, I mentioned earlier that these are going to be 20 miles off the coast. So they might actually be visible from the coast, particularly depending on visibility on a given day. So there might block some of the view, but it certainly will be different than having them on land. So that is the third argument for moving forward with massive offshore wind farms. Now let's turn our attention to the case against. Number one, offshore wind energy is very expensive. So it is dramatically more expensive than all other energy sources, which is kind of surprising. So the U.S. Energy Information Administration report from last March, when it calculated offshore wind's what's called levelized cost of electricity, it's more than 3 times higher than natural gas, standalone solar projects, and onshore wind. So even after you factor in tax credits, it's still 2.5 times more expensive than any of these sources. It's even 25% more expensive than advanced nuclear, which is one of the kind of more expensive forms of energy. And so this has been a key problem for offshore wind. Here's a quote from scientists in Silicon Valley says, to date, offshore wind energy in the United States has been held back by a combination of high costs, lack of government support, and along the West Coast geography. So why is it so expensive? Well, as I explained a bit of earlier, this is a different infrastructure that's required because you have a floating turbine. And so 75% of the total cost actually has to do with the underwater infrastructure. How are you anchoring these massive turbines to the ocean floor without a solid structure going down from the turbine to the floor itself? And so the good news is that offshore wind farms have actually cut their price by about 60% since 2010. And turbines today can generate twice the power. So things are improving. And actually, President Biden announced that he is doing what is called the floating offshore wind shot, which will aim to reduce the cost of floating technologies by more than 70% by 2035 to about 45 megawatts per hour. Now, that would actually put offshore wind in the vicinity of those other costs, that it's now 3 times more expensive. And it would actually, be just north of natural gas and solar and cheaper than hydroelectric energy. So right now, offshore wind is massively expensive. It has seen improvement over the last few years. And there are efforts, particularly from the federal government, to drive innovation on that front. But we are still not anywhere near having this be, affordable in the context of other energy sources. Number 2, in the case against, we currently lack the infrastructure to build and operate these wind farms. So remember, in addition to constructing the actual floating turbines and the anchoring assembly there, California will actually need to build new port infrastructure to fabricate and assemble the turbines, at the port, and then to transmit energy from those turbines in and receive that. So Adam Stern, who's the executive director of Offshore Wind California, which is a industry group that's focused on this, he actually believes that lack of infrastructure and underdevelopment of infrastructure in California is the main reason that the auction bids, though high, $757 million, was actually lower than we're seeing on the East Coast, where the infrastructure is more developed. He says, our state is not as far along in preparing for offshore wind in areas like port infrastructure, transmission, and procurement policies. And Cal Matters also reports, they say the scale and size of the technology means California would need to rapidly build specialized port facilities and servicing vessels to construct and transport the gigantic turbines. It's critical that the state start now investing in transmission and port infrastructure and developing a clear roadmap on permitting and procurement. So actually, a 2016 analysis was done by the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, and they found that California would require significant investments in fabrication and assembly ports as well, and may even require new facilities. They actually looked at the Morro Bay site where, this offshore property was auctioned off. And what they found is that there is no existing infrastructure or harbor in the study area that can be upgraded to be what's considered a large facility. And so in both cases, it says a new port facility appears technically feasible, but would be subject to numerous onshore and in-water constraints, would need to be planned to avoid, minimize, and mitigate potential impacts. They also say in this report that significant new overwater coverage would be needed to build a port facility at either site. So this is not a super simple process to build the infrastructure to support these massive offshore wind farms. Now, California Independent System Operator, which oversees operation of California's electrical grid, they think that this could be done a bit easier than others are suggesting. So they think that it's possible, for example, to use a retired gas plant and 2 soon-to-be retired nuclear generators on the Central Coast to help with the transmission of energy. So we'll see if that's possible, but either way, there's going to be work that needs to be done in order for this to really happen. Okay, number 3, and the one that was framed up from the start, which is that offshore wind farms will hurt the environment and fishing industry. So offshore wind farms, have potential to affect the marine environment and the fishing industry, and then in some places, Native American tribes, as an attorney from the Natural Resources Defense Council explains. Sea turtles, fish, and marine mammals could become entangled in the cables, while birds and bats could get caught in turbines. There's a lot we don't know about offshore wind in the West and what that means for various marine and coastal ecosystems. So in Europe, where, again, this has been going on for many years, they've had offshore wind farms for a while, researchers actually published a study last year warning of the impact of offshore wind farms on the marine environment. Here's what it says. a scientific team on marine sciences and geography recommends excluding and moving offshore wind farms from the protected areas in the Mediterranean due to the serious negative impact these facilities can cause on the marine biodiversity and landscape. So that is a pretty dire warning, you could say. Now, it's important to note that they were looking specifically at ecologically fragile environments, and so it wasn't necessarily broadly applicable to all of the ocean. So that is an important caveat, but it's still worth us considering. What's also important to note is that the fishing industry is not a big fan of these projects moving forward. So Tom Hafer, who's the president of the Morro Bay Commercial Fishermen's Organization, explains the industry's concern this way. He says, "We're totally against this. We've been consulting with Castle Wind people for a long time, and we helped pick the spot and developed an MOU on an area that we thought would be sustainable for us. That was about 120 square miles. This is 399 square miles. We're going to lose a whole bunch of fishing grounds. There will be cables in the water. We don't know how the whales will react. There are a lot of unknowns. People don't realize how massive this project will be." So I think what's interesting here is that he's saying, on one hand, he's totally against this, but also that they had found something that was on a smaller scale that actually could work for them. And now this is, more than 3 times the size of what they had originally agreed to. And so it's important to note that he's not saying he's totally against offshore wind in general, but that the size and scale of this project is what makes him against it, and also the lack of knowledge of what will actually happen here. And that's an important one, in particular the note of whales. So you might have seen that there's this big controversy erupting over whales dying off the east coast of the US, and environmentalist groups are blaming that on offshore wind farms. Now, scientists are saying that that's actually not the cause of the deaths of these whales, that is, this is being misinformation. In either case, the reality is that, in particular on the West Coast, with this different type of wind turbine, that a lot is not known about what the effects will be on the fishing industry and on marine life. So on the East Coast, commercial fishers, even beyond the whole whale controversy, have really been sounding the alarm. And they're saying that problems exist even in spots where the turbines have yet to go up, just preparing the construction site. What they say is that commercial fishermen, along with charter fishing boats, are seeing fish flee from the noise of the site surveys. So just where they're doing the surveying analysis, only returning to regular spots a few days later. Cables and other construction needs are creating changes in the marine environment, which can be particularly harmful to bottom-feeding species like scallops, clams, and flounder. In fact, a group of fishing companies actually filed a lawsuit last year against Vineyard Wind, that's up in the East Coast, arguing that they would be economically ruined by the project. So clearly the fishing industry is against at least the scale of this, and environmentalist groups also tend to be arguing that we don't know enough now to be sure that this won't impact the environment. However, those who are for this, basically, while they're suggesting that they're going to mitigate the environmental impacts of this, are arguing that they need to move forward with this, even if it does have an environmental impact, because of the urgency of climate change. And so the assemblyman who wrote AB 525, which required the California Energy Commission to put forth these goals, says, "We know that we have to do something different. Offshore wind is different. That being said, we're also acutely aware that there are impacts on communities." Brandon Southall, who is a California Ocean Alliance scientist, we cited some of his information earlier, he makes the same argument. He says that, "I hope when we're looking at these concerns about impacts that we as a scientific community and as a conservation community don't lose sight of the fact that we need sustainable alternative energy. We need a balance of informed and conservative cautionary decision-making, but not so precautionary and so afraid of the uncertainty that we never get there." And so he is pushing back and saying, yes, we don't know much, and there might be impact, but it is justified because we need something different, to quote the assemblyman who wrote AB 525. And so that is the third case against. Let's go back and just review our 3 both cases for this and cases against it. On the case for, basically offshore wind will provide a huge amount of renewable energy for the state Number two, that it provides that energy at times when other renewable energy sources are not providing energy. And number three, that it does not consume land or take up land or likely block the view. Now, in the case against, as a reminder, offshore wind is super expensive right now, 3 times more expensive than most other energy sources. And while there are efforts to change that, that is not going down in the immediate future. Number two, we just don't have the infrastructure at the ports necessary to facilitate and enable energy transmission and the construction and transportation of these turbines. And then number three, there is a lot we don't know about the impact on the environment and the fishing industry, and a lot of signs point to the fact that there could be significant impact there. All right, so that is the argument for moving forward with building offshore wind farms off the coast, and the argument against. I want to know what you think of this. Should California move forward aggressively going after this, or should it pump the brakes? Let me know in the comments what you are thinking about this. Would love to hear if you think we missed something on either argument, or there are other arguments that we should be considering as we frame up the debate around this issue. What I want to do now is share my assessment of this debate. So I think what's pretty clear is that offshore wind energy has tremendous potential. I mean, the National Renewable Energy Laboratory said that there could be 200 gigawatts of power generated off the coast there. That is tremendous. And so we definitely want to take steps in that direction. However, we need to be thoughtful about how we do that. Typically in a process like this, if you think of any entrepreneurial pursuit, you would start with a small scale pilot before you go massive. So the scientists who are developing these first, floating wind turbines that will be used, they say this about the project. They say the turbines off Eureka, which again is the Northern California, would be in waters almost 2,500 feet deep. For Morro Bay, which is a Central Coast site, it would be over 3,300 feet deep. No project in the world exists in waters this deep. The deepest project to date is in Norway, which is only 721 feet deep. A third of the Eureka one and a fifth of the Morro Bay one. That adds cost and risk because no one's building anything this big or this deep yet. So we are trying to do something completely new. And my concern is that we're doing it in such a way that we are just rushing full speed because we've set somewhat of an arbitrary climate goal that we are trying to hit. We feel like we're on the hook to hit, and we're not taking into consideration what we don't know. And that is one of the main issues, I think, with this effort. The California Ocean Alliance says there's a lot of uncertainty around it. The environmental attorney at the NRDC says there's a lot we don't know. And that is true. We're doing something first in the world, and there's a lot we don't know. So we should be cautious about how quickly we're going and experiment and see what we can learn before doing something really massive. Add to that the fact that offshore wind energy prices are currently 3 times the cost of other energy sources that are more readily available to us right now. And so rushing into this before we give a chance for Biden's wind shot attempt to cut prices to actually have an impact, we're going to end up having less affordable energy and potentially having consequences of this that we don't yet know. And add to that the fact that right now we don't even have the port infrastructure to be able to facilitate this. And so for those reasons, what I would recommend is that California scale back on the existing projects, not rush so quickly into such a massive project with so much uncertainty and so much unknown, and instead start with a small scale pilot in a few places, really allow the technology to develop while doing research on the impact on the marine environment and the fishing industry, so that when it comes time to roll out a massive 4.5 gigawatt wind farm, we actually know what's going to happen, and we have the technology and the port infrastructure to be able to facilitate and support that. That is my assessment. Would love to know what you think about whether California should move forward with this. Do you agree that we should pump the brakes on this and start smaller, figure out what we don't know now, allow the price to come down so that when the price is in check and we've learned and are able to mitigate the impact on the environment and the fishing industry, we are then able to scale without all the unintended consequences that might come along with this. Thanks so much for tuning in to today's debate. I would love to know what you think about this debate. If you found this interesting, if you learned something, if it opened your mind to a different way of seeing things, I would love for you to share this with someone else who you think might find it interesting and to subscribe to this. Thanks so much for tuning into this debate, and we will see you back with our next debate.